Hello and welcome back to the second simple PHP login script tutorial. In the last tutorial I showed you how to make a very basic script that lets you log in without a database, and basically we had some variables set in the PHP code which when entered lets us log in and go to our user page. In this tutorial I'm just going to quickly go over how to create a MySQL database for those of you who've never created one before. I'm going to go over all the different bits and what they do. Then I'm going to show you how to connect to it and retrieve bits of data that is saved in our database to let the user log in with a username and password. So first of all I'm going to go to phpMyAdmin to create the database. phpMyAdmin is a way of creating a database with a graphical interface basically. So we don't have to just write the SQL straight into the console or a PHP script to run and create the database. So when we go on phpMyAdmin, which comes with XAMPP, because I'm hosting this on my computer with XAMPP. So first I'm just going to click on databases, and then in here I'm going to create a new one and call it tutorials for the sake of this. You might want to call it the name of your web application that you're making, maybe, or something like that. Or if you're just doing this as a kind of test exercise, you might want to just call it tests, something. Okay, so I've created the database now. So in here we're going to create a table, which we can either click that or we can just create it straight here. So I'm going to create this table called members, and I'm going to give it seven columns will probably be okay for now. Might change this at a later stage and add more columns to it if needed, but for now we'll be okay with 7. Okay, the first row in our table is going to be called ID. This is the identifier of our table basically, so you'd normally have an ID for every single table that you create, and it's going to auto increment. It's going to be a unique number, so every time someone joins that number goes up by 1, and that user has that number which is completely different to the their friend's account ID number, for example. So we can use that number to perform different actions with in the future, maybe. So we know that it's them. Okay, so the type is going to be integer, which is already set as int. Length doesn't matter for this. We're gonna, where it says index, we need to click primary. That just tells us that this is the primary row in this table. Second one we're going to call username, and then I'm going to create password. Then I'm just going to put first and last name. So first name, last name. Before we get too far ahead, I'm just going to change all these to varchars. Basically, when we're saying that it's a type of varchar, we're saying that this field in the table is going to have characters in there, so letters from the alphabet. It can also have numbers in as well, but an integer is just numbers. The varchar is a mixture of numbers and characters, and you could have exclamation marks or pound symbols or dollar symbols or something like that in there if you want. So I'm going to give it a length of 50. Yeah, 50 is alright. Password, I'm going to give it 255, and that's the maximum you can have for varchar anyway. The first name I'm going to give 30 characters, that's plenty. That should be enough for the last name as well, 30. So the next one I'm going to have activated, and this is going to be enum, or enumerated it's short for. So we'll go down and look for that. It's here in the string section, enum. We're going to have two options. It's going to be 0 or a 1. To do that, we just use a single quote 0 and closing single quote, comma to separate it, and the same with single quote 1 single quote. So we're just saying there's going to be two options. So imagine a box. If you had like a drop-down box, for example, you've got two options, 0 or 1. So it's not going to be a drop-down menu, but that was just a way of explaining it. So this field that is going to be entered when they register is going to accept either the 0 or the 1. And by default, we're going to define it as 0. So when they join, it's going to be set to 0, so they haven't activated their account yet. And we would create a little bit of script to send them an email to their email address, which we don't have an email part in here yet, but we might add that in a later tutorial. You could add that now if you wanted. You just have a varchar and probably 255 would be fine. Then just call it email if you wanted to do that. I'll probably be doing that in another tutorial anyway, but for this simple tutorial we will be using email. For the last one, I'm just going to create something that we're probably not going to use in this tutorial, but we're probably going to use in this tutorial after this, which I'll explain more about at the end. This is going to be called rand salt. You could change that name to something else, but basically it's short for random salt. And this is part of our password encryption system that we're going to create next time. So for now I'm just going to call it rand salt and give it a type of varchar, 255, and that looks okay to me. Let me just check it. Yeah, that looks okay. Okay, so it's now created the table. As you can see, everything looks okay. We've got our table now, so we've got to actually create a little piece of script that actually connects to it. I'm going to create another PHP page called dbconnect.php, and in this page all we're going to have is one line of actual code, and well, three overall with that, but that's just, you know, the opening PHP, closing PHP tags. But the line we're going to have is one variable, which is going to be dbcon for database connection. It's going to be equal to the function MySQL I connect. MySQL I is basically an improved version of the MySQL functions that were built into PHP. So before we used to use MySQL connect, but now we use MySQL I. That's the recommended way. You could still use the older way, but there's no point because it's less secure and it's much better to use the improved functions. This function takes 4 parameters. The first one is where the MySQL database is hosted. So in my case it's going to be localhost. If you're on a web server, doing this as a live test on your server. It's probably going to be localhost as well. Some companies will actually specify a certain URL that you've got to put in for the location of their database, so it could be sql.somedomain.com for example, but most of the time it's going to be localhost. The second one is our username, which by default is going to be root if you're using XAMPP. So you just enter your username in there. The third parameter is the password, which in XAMPP isn't set. XAMPP is going to be used for locally testing scripts basically, so you won't be using this on a production server that people are going to connect to. And if you are creating this on a web server, I do recommend a very strong password, mixture of capitals, lowercase, numbers, random bits of characters in there like question marks and stuff like that. Make it long and complicated. Don't ever share it with anyone. So make sure it's very secure. Like I say, if you're using XAMPP, you won't have one by default. You could change it, you could have a password, but I'm just going to leave it without for this tutorial. The last parameter is the actual database that we're connecting to. So we created a tutorials database. So yeah, these are our databases, and we're in the tutorials database at the moment. So that's all we need, and this is going to be included into our index page. So I'm going to do that now. Basically, we're just going to include that line, so dynamically using PHP. So if I had 100 different pages, I wouldn't have to write that line each time. I'd just include that that script, which isn't long and hard to remember, but say if you change the username or the password or something like that, you just change it in this file here, and then it will change for every other page that you're using the connection, so you won't have to change it in each page basically. That's the only reason we're doing it. So in the if statement, that is looking for the username when they've entered it. We're now going to include that file, include once I'm going to use. It's going to be dbconnect.php. So I've just included that database connection file that we created. We've basically got that file now into our page, and so we can use that database connection variable in our functions. So I'm going to get rid of these variables because we don't need them anymore. I'm going to create some new ones in a minute. So they were just what we used before without a database. Once we've done that, we're going to, as before, we get the posted variables and we use a function on it to escape stuff. I mean, I was using the strip tags function as an example of that you would be using some kind of function there to make them the variables that have entered safe to use, because we'll be actually including it in our SQL statement later, so we don't want them adding extra bits to our statement and causing some problems, and because they could use an SQL injection. So to help get around that, we're going to use a function called MySQL real escape string, which is quite long-winded, but once you've basically all it's going to do is escape characters that we don't really want to be in our string. So if they put some quotes in, like single quotes, it'll just escape it before it. It'll just put a backslash and escape whatever dodgy character they've entered, just to make it safer. So I'm going to keep this strip tags function here. We don't really need it. We could just get rid of that completely and put this post in this part here instead of using the variable that we've already set. But I'm just going to keep it as the strip tags function that we already created. We're setting the username, which was set to equal to what they've entered. We're setting it equal to itself, but also we need to connect to the database to use this function first. So we use dbcon, which we created in the db connect, and that is just going to allow us to escape that string before we actually use it in our SQL statement. We do the same with the password, so we're just real escaping it, making it safe to use. So after that, we're going to have to connect to the actual database and retrieve the data. I've just created a SQL variable. I'm going to set it equal to this line of SQL here. So basically, if you've not seen SQL before, all we're saying is we're selecting the three items. We're selecting the ID, the username and the password, because we are going to be using those three different bits of information later in the script. So we're going to be using the ID to set us in our session later, and the username and password we need to retrieve so we can compare it with what they've entered to make sure it is them. And then we say from the members table, so you always put from the table that you want. Then you say where something is equal to something else. So we're saying where the username equals the we encapsulate the username variable, so we're setting it equal to what they've entered in the post request earlier, and we say after we've said where the username is equal to what they've entered, we say and where the activated row is equal to 1. So that means if that's true and it's set to 1, they've clicked the email activation link and they're not some kind of spam bot, so they're a proper member in our system and can be used. And at the end we just use limit 1. Limit 1, all that just says is this is only going to be done once, so we're only getting one lot of information for this statement. This where part of the statement is just saying we want to select this information, but we want to make sure that it is only that username that they've entered that we get, so we don't get some other person's information instead of theirs. We'll be using more MySQL databases in future PHP tutorials, and there are lots of useful tutorials and websites already out there to help you learn more about MySQL. Okay, so next we create a query variable, which is going to be equal to MySQLi query, and this is the function we use to run the query. So we're running this SQL query. So again, the first parameter is the connection to the database using that PHP file we created. The second parameter is the SQL statement, so then that's going to run and perform what we want it to. Okay, so now we've run the query, so we need to get that information into our local variables. So first we need to fetch the information row by row. So we use another variable called row and set it equal to the MySQLi fetch row function. We run it on the query, which is just this here. So it's just the query on the SQL statement connected to our database. And then the last little bit we need for this page is the actual variables, which are what we deleted earlier. So we've actually created our variables again that we deleted, but this time we're setting the user ID in the database, username and password, equal to the row, and then we use the square bracket and then 0 and then a closing square bracket, and 0 means the first row. We always count from 0 instead of 1, so the first row is 0, the second one is 1, and then the third is 2. So we're saying we want the first row of information, which is going to be the user ID, which we've got here, and then the username, which we've said here, and then the password. So if we had this password then username, you would switch that around. So we've executed the SQL statement, we've fetched it into a row, and then we've set the rows equal to the variables that we can use back down in our if statement to make sure that the username and password are what is entered in the database. Okay, so this should work fine now. So we could just go and enter our information and create a dummy account. But first, before I do that, I'm just going to add one more line. Okay, so this last line is something we're only going to be using for testing, just to show you in this simple tutorial. And in this third part of this tutorial series, I'm going to go over the best practices for password encryption and why this method is not secure at all. But for the basic tutorial that I'm doing, we're just going to set the password that we've run the escape function on and the strip tag function on. We're going to set it equal to the MD5 hash of itself, basically. So MD5 is a hashing algorithm, which I'm not going to go into it at the moment because I'm going to have a whole tutorial about hashing and password encryption and salts and stuff like that. But basically it just creates a long string which is unique for each password, well, not each password, but each string that's entered. So you entered 1, 2, 3, 4. The MD5 would always return the same for that, for 1, 2, 3, 4. If you entered 1, 2, 3, it would come out with something completely and utterly different, won't look anything like the same, or it shouldn't do. You might use this in kind of disguising bits of information so they're not just in pure text format. Like I say, we wouldn't normally use MD5 or any of the other common hashing algorithms on our password to store normally. It's just a simple thing that we're just going to do in this tutorial. So I'm just going to stress this now. If you're using this for a proper web application, don't use this for storing information. It's alright for testing, and for now that's how I'm going to leave it. So we can actually test this out now. I'm going to create a person in our database. I've gone in the database and on the table, got an insert here at the top. So the ID we don't even need to set because it'll already do that for us. It's going to be 1 because it's the first person in the table. So the username is going to be Peter. Password, we can't just enter our password. We're going to have to use a website like this to create the MD5 hash of the password that we're entering. When we get the password that they've entered and we use the MD5 function on it, this is what the output is. So if you and I looked at that, we wouldn't know what the password was, but we could just look that up and if we wanted to know what that was. I'm sure there's plenty of websites out there that will tell us what that is because so many people have entered it. Okay, so we just paste that MD5 output there. I'm just going to fill out the first name and last name. Don't really need to for this test. I'm going to make sure I select 1 to say that I've activated the account. I'm just going to leave this empty because we're going to use that in the next tutorial. So click go. Like I say, in another tutorial I'll actually create a page that would let you join the system and maybe even send an email activation link to the email that they've entered, instead of having to do it manually like this. But for now it should be okay like this. So we're going to put this on the server and then I'm going to actually test that account we just created. Okay, so I'm just going to log in again. So we entered the password, which the MD5 function is going to run on that, and it's going to make sure that it's set to the MD5 that was entered as in the database. And there we are. It's let me log in, and the ID is 1, which is correct because if you look in our database, we've got the ID is 1 there, and I could change that. In fact, let's change that to something random like that. Now I'd have to log out and log in again to see the change, because once we've retrieved it, we've saved it in our session, so we'll have to create a new session to get that ID. So I'll just log in again. There we are. It comes out with our ID from the database that I've just entered. And of course we could create a much more complicated site and retrieve lots more information. Rather than having this simple output here, we could just we could have a nice page with like a blog site or something, or some kind of social network, and we could have information about us that we've entered, like a bio and pages we've liked. It could all be retrieved from our database. So that's all I've got time for in this tutorial. Next time, as I say, I'll probably be going over password encryption and just the basics of password encryption, like the absolute minimum that we should have on our system to make it more secure. And depending on how long that goes on to, I might be able to create a register page or some kind of join form that lets us members create an account on the website. Then after that, I might create it a little kind of blog system, just to show you what type of system we could use this login for. If you have any ideas of what you want me to show you in the future tutorials, let me know in the comments below. If you have any questions about this tutorial, please feel free to ask in the comments as well. You can also contact me on Facebook and Twitter. I'll leave my Facebook page and Twitter URL in the description. And of course, as always, the code for all this that we've created today and all the pages that we're using is going to be on my website. The link to that is going to be in the description too. So thank you for watching this tutorial, hope it was useful, and I will be back very soon with another little PHP tutorial.